The warm April morning of 1943 found Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim at his headquarters for Army Group Africa in Tunisia, studying intelligence reports that documented the overwhelming Allied superiority massing for final offensive against Axis positions in North Africa. The assessments showed Allied forces outnumbering German and Italian defenders by ratios exceeding 3-to-1 in infantry, 5-to-1 in tanks, and 10-to-1 in aircraft. The supply situation reports confirmed that Axis forces received perhaps 10% of required ammunition, fuel, and food due to Allied interdiction of Mediterranean shipping routes. The defensive positions analysis revealed that German forces occupied shrinking perimeter around Tunis and Bizerte, with no strategic depth, no mobile reserves, and no capacity to withstand sustained Allied assault. Von Arnim, who had assumed command in March after Erwin Rommel's departure, who had been ordered by Hitler to hold Tunisia at all costs, who commanded forces that included veterans of Afrika Korps and reinforcements transferred from Europe, was confronting evidence that Tunisia campaign had reached its inevitable conclusion, that Allied material superiority combined with Axis supply collapse made defeat not just probable, but imminent and total. The recognition that Tunisia was lost came not through single revelation, but through accumulation of evidence through April that demonstrated holding North Africa was operationally impossible, that evacuation was strategically necessary but politically unacceptable to Hitler, that 250,000 German and Italian troops would be sacrificed in doomed defense because acknowledging reality contradicted Führer's insistence that every position must be held regardless of cost. The background to the Tunisia disaster traced to November 1942 Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, that had created Second Front in North Africa and had positioned American and British forces to attack Axis positions from west, while British 8th Army advanced from east after victory at El Alamein. The German response to Torch had been to rush reinforcements to Tunisia to prevent immediate Allied capture of territory and to establish defensive positions that might enable Axis forces to maintain foothold in North Africa. The decision to reinforce Tunisia rather than evacuating forces from Libya represented Hitler's determination to hold territory regardless of operational logic, reflected his conviction that willpower could overcome material disadvantages, demonstrated pattern that would characterize German strategy through Tunisia campaign. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Axis forces in Mediterranean theater from headquarters in Italy, had advocated for Tunisia reinforcement with arguments that holding North Africa tied down Allied forces that might otherwise be employed against southern Europe, that abandoning Africa without fighting would damage Axis prestige with consequences for relationships with neutral nations, that German tactical superiority might enable smaller Axis forces to contain larger Allied armies through skillful defensive operations. Kesselring's advocacy reflected genuine belief that Tunisia could be held indefinitely and reflected his institutional role as commander responsible for Mediterranean operations whose success depended on maintaining positions there. The forces that Germany committed to Tunisia through November 1942 to March 1943 included elite formations transferred from Europe, 5th Panzer Army units, Luftwaffe field divisions, Waffen-SS formations that represented substantial military capability, but that would be trapped in North Africa without capacity to withdraw once Allied forces compressed defensive perimeter. The commitment reflected Hitler's insistence that Tunisia be held and reflected High Command's acceptance that maintaining North African front justified allocating forces that were desperately needed in Russia, and that would eventually be lost when Tunisia position became untenable. General der Panzertruppen Jürgen von Arnim, appointed to command 5th Panzer Army in Tunisia in December 1942, assessed situation upon arrival and concluded that Axis forces faced fundamental problems that would make defending Tunisia progressively more difficult. Von Arnim identified that Allied forces possessed material superiority that would grow over time, that Axis supply lines across Mediterranean were vulnerable to air and naval interdiction, that defensive perimeter around Tunis was insufficient in depth to enable mobile defense, that Italian forces defending portions of line were inadequately equipped and trained for resisting sustained Allied attacks. Von Arnim's professional judgment was that Tunisia could be held temporarily, but not indefinitely, and that operational planning should prepare for eventual evacuation when position became untenable. The January to February 1943 battles that German forces fought against Allied advances demonstrated both continuing German tactical competence and operational reality, that tactical victories could not overcome strategic disadvantages. German counterattacks at Kasserine Pass in February achieved tactical success, penetrating American positions, capturing equipment and prisoners, demonstrating that German armor and infantry remained capable of defeating less experienced Allied forces in favorable circumstances. Yet the tactical victory achieved nothing strategically. American forces re-established positions after German withdrawal. Allied material losses were replaced within days. Operational situation remained that Axis forces occupied shrinking perimeter with deteriorating supply situation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Axis forces during Kasserine operations, assessed after the battle that tactical victories were meaningless if they could not alter strategic situation, that German forces lacked resources to exploit successes achieved against Allied positions. That time favored Allies whose strength grew monthly, while Axis strength declined due to supply shortages and irreplaceable losses. Rommel's recommendation to OKW was that Tunisia should be evacuated before Allied offensive eliminated Axis forces entirely, that preserving 250,000 troops for employment in Europe was strategically sounder than sacrificing them in defense that would fail regardless of German determination. The February 26th meeting, where Rommel briefed Hitler about Tunisia's situation, represented one of few occasions where Field Commander attempted to convince Führer that withdrawal was militarily necessary. Rommel presented evidence about Allied superiority, about supply shortages undermining combat effectiveness, about inadequacy of defensive positions for sustaining prolonged defense, about inevitability of defeat if forces remained in Tunisia. Hitler's response was to reject evacuation recommendation, to insist that Tunisia be held, to emphasize political and symbolic importance of maintaining Axis presence in North Africa, to suggest that German forces had succeeded against material odds before and could do so again in Tunisia. The March 9th departure of Rommel from Africa on sick leave marked removal of Germany's most successful desert commander from theater, where his experience and reputation might have influenced strategic decisions. Rommel's replacement by von Arnim represented appointment of competent but less prestigious commander whose recommendations to OKW would carry less weight, whose assessments about Tunisia's hopeless situation would be more easily dismissed as defeatism. The command change ensured that professional military advice about necessity of evacuation would not receive serious consideration from Hitler or from OKW. The supply crisis that intensified through March to April 1943 reflected success of Allied air and naval interdiction of Mediterranean shipping routes. Allied aircraft operating from Malta and from North African bases attacked Axis convoys crossing from Italy to Tunisia, sank cargo ships and tankers carrying fuel, ammunition, and supplies, forced convoys to take longer routes that increased transit time and reduced delivery quantities. Allied naval forces intercepted convoys, sank vessels through surface action and submarine attack, created situation where Axis forces in Tunisia received fraction of supplies required to sustain operations. The specific pattern of Allied interdiction operations demonstrated sophisticated campaign that systematically destroyed Axis supply capability. Allied intelligence monitored Axis convoy schedules through signals, intercepts, and agent reports, positioned aircraft and naval forces along expected routes, conducted coordinated attacks that overwhelmed convoy defenses. The targeting prioritized tankers and ammunition ships whose loss would have maximum impact on Axis combat capability, demonstrated that Allied command understood that destroying logistics was more effective than attempting to defeat Axis forces through direct combat when supply shortages were degrading their effectiveness independently. The statistics documenting convoy losses illuminated the campaign's devastating effectiveness. Of supplies loaded in Italy for transport to Tunisia through March to April 1943, approximately 40% were sunk en route by Allied action. Of supplies that reached Tunisian ports, additional significant percentages were destroyed by Allied air attacks on port facilities and on transportation infrastructure before they could reach frontline units. The cumulative losses meant that Axis forces received perhaps 10 to 15% of supplies that left Italy, creating deficit that accumulated over weeks and that progressively degraded combat effectiveness. The German and Italian naval forces, attempting to protect convoys, demonstrated continuing tactical competence, but revealed inability to develop effective responses to Allied interdiction. Convoys were escorted by destroyers and torpedo boats that engaged Allied aircraft and surface forces, achieved some success in protecting cargo vessels, but could not prevent losses when Allied forces concentrated multiple aircraft or vessels against single convoy. The escort vessels themselves suffered losses that reduced capability to protect subsequent convoys, creating downward spiral where declining escort strength allowed increasing losses, which further reduced escort availability. The Luftwaffe transport aircraft employed to supplement seaborne supply demonstrated limitations of air transport for sustaining large forces. Transport aircraft flying from Sicily to Tunisia delivered perhaps 500 to 1,000 tons daily under optimal conditions, quantity that was inadequate to meet requirements exceeding 2,000 tons daily. Allied fighters attacking transport aircraft inflicted increasing losses as air superiority shifted decisively to Allies, reducing delivery quantities as aircraft were shot down faster than they could be replaced. The transport operations demonstrated that air supply could not substitute for seaborne supply when maritime routes were interdicted. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, serving as Chief of Staff to von Arnim, compiled weekly assessments documenting supply deliveries versus requirements. Bayerlein's reports showed that Axis forces required approximately 60,000 tons monthly of supplies to maintain combat effectiveness. The deliveries averaged approximately 6,000 tons monthly through March-April. The 10% delivery rate was creating cumulative deficits in ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies that degraded combat capability daily. The statistics demonstrated that supply situation alone made sustained defense impossible, regardless of tactical competence or determination. The specific manifestations of supply shortages at unit level illustrated how material deficiencies affected tactical capabilities. Artillery batteries received perhaps 10 shells per gun daily when effective defensive fire required hundreds of shells daily. Tank units received fuel allocations of perhaps 50 kilometers of movement per vehicle per week when defensive operations required daily repositioning to meet Allied threats. Infantry units received rations of perhaps 800 calories per soldier daily when combat operations required 3,000 calories to maintain physical effectiveness. The deficits accumulated over weeks until forces were combat ineffective due to material shortages rather than due to combat losses. The ammunition shortages that developed through April forced German artillery to ration fire to essential missions only, limited tank operations because armor could not be supported by artillery preparation, reduced infantry defensive capability because positions could not be supported by suppressive fire against Allied attacks. The fuel shortages immobilized German armor that possessed vehicles but lacked fuel to operate them, forced infantry to march rather than using motorized transport, eliminated mobility that was essential for defensive operations requiring repositioning forces to meet Allied threats. The food shortages reduced rations to starvation levels that weakened soldiers physically and undermined morale, created medical problems as malnutrition made troops susceptible to disease. The medical supply shortages created humanitarian crisis within Axis forces as wounded could not be treated adequately. Field hospitals lacked anesthesia for performing surgery, lacked antibiotics for preventing infections, lacked bandages and sutures for treating wounds. Wounded soldiers who might have survived with proper medical care died from infections or from shock because medical supplies were unavailable. The medical crisis demoralized troops who understood that being wounded meant suffering that could have been prevented if supplies were available. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, serving as Chief of Staff to von Arnim, compiled weekly assessments documenting supply deliveries versus requirements. Bayerlein's report showed that Axis forces required approximately 60,000 tons monthly of supplies to maintain combat effectiveness, that deliveries averaged approximately 6,000 tons monthly through March-April. That 10% delivery rate was creating cumulative deficits in ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies that degraded combat capability daily. The statistics demonstrated that supply situation alone made sustained defense impossible regardless of tactical competence or determination. The ammunition shortages that developed through April forced German artillery to ration fire to essential missions only, limited tank operations because armor could not be supported by artillery preparation, reduced infantry defensive capability because positions could not be supported by suppressive fire against Allied attacks. The fuel shortages immobilized German armor that possessed vehicles but lacked fuel to operate them, forced infantry to march rather than using motorized transport, eliminated mobility that was essential for defensive operations requiring repositioning forces to meet Allied threats. The food shortages reduced rations to starvation levels that weakened soldiers physically and undermined morale, created medical problems as malnutrition made troops susceptible to disease. The April intelligence assessments about Allied preparations for final offensive documented force concentrations that left no doubt about Allied intentions and about overwhelming superiority that Axis forces would face. British First Army in North, American Second Corps in Center, British Eighth Army in South were positioned for coordinated attacks designed to compress Axis perimeter simultaneously from multiple directions. Allied forces possessed over 300,000 troops versus approximately 175,000 Axis defenders, possessed over 1,200 tanks versus fewer than 100 operational German tanks, possessed complete air superiority, with over 3,000 aircraft versus perhaps 100 Luftwaffe aircraft that could fly due to fuel shortages. General der Panzertruppen Gustav von Wehrst, commanding 5th Panzer Army's armored forces, reported in mid-April that his tank formations were effectively immobilized by fuel shortages and were reduced to static defensive role rather than mobile operations for which they were designed and trained. Von Wehrst noted that German tanks possessed technological advantages over many Allied tanks, but that advantages were meaningless when German armor could not maneuver, could not be concentrated against Allied breakthroughs, could not be repositioned to threatened sectors. The report emphasized that armor without fuel was collection of metal boxes rather than effective weapons system. The Italian component of Axis forces defending Tunisia represented additional weakness that German commanders understood would affect defensive capabilities. Italian divisions held portions of defensive perimeter, but lacked anti-tank weapons to defend against Allied armor, lacked artillery support to suppress Allied attacks, lacked mobility to reposition when positions were penetrated. German commanders anticipated that Italian positions would collapse quickly when Allied offensive began, that German forces would have to extend their lines to cover sectors Italian forces could not hold, that defensive perimeter would fragment as weakest positions failed under Allied pressure. The April 22nd beginning of Allied final offensive, Operation Vulcan, demonstrated overwhelming Allied superiority and confirmed German assessments about impossibility of sustained defense. British First Army attacked in north toward Tunis with concentrated armor and artillery support that shattered German defensive positions. American forces attacked in center, achieving rapid penetration. British Eighth Army attacked from south, completing encirclement of Axis forces. The simultaneous attacks on multiple axes prevented Axis forces from concentrating reserves against any single breakthrough and created operational collapse within days. The artillery preparation that preceded Allied infantry and armor assaults demonstrated material advantages that German forces could not match. Allied artillery bombardments involved hundreds of guns, firing thousands of shells at German defensive positions, destroying fortifications, suppressing defensive fire, creating conditions where Allied infantry could advance with minimal casualties. German artillery attempting to respond to Allied bombardments was limited to perhaps 10 shells per gun due to ammunition shortages, could not suppress Allied attacks, could not support German counterattacks, demonstrated how completely supply shortages had neutralized capabilities that German forces possessed in equipment, but could not employ due to lack of ammunition. The air support that Allied forces enjoyed during Vulcan represented advantage that was decisive in determining tactical outcomes. Allied aircraft attacked any German troop concentration, destroyed vehicles attempting to move supplies forward, interdicted roads that German forces needed for repositioning reserves. German attempts to concentrate forces for counterattacks were detected by Allied reconnaissance aircraft and were attacked by fighter bombers before attacks could be launched. The air superiority meant that German forces could operate only at night when visibility limited Allied air operations, creating tactical constraint that reduced German effectiveness. The specific tactical situation in first days of Vulcan demonstrated how completely Allied material superiority determined outcomes regardless of German tactical skill. German defensive positions that should have required sustained attacks to capture fell within hours as ammunition shortages prevented defensive fire from stopping Allied assaults. German counterattacks that might have restored positions could not be launched because fuel shortages immobilized armor and because artillery could not provide fire support. German attempts to establish new defensive lines failed because Allied air power attacked any concentration of forces and because logistics collapse prevented supplies from reaching forward units. The British First Army's advance toward Tunis achieved penetrations of German defensive lines within first 48 hours of offensive. The 6th and 7th Armoured Divisions, advancing with infantry support, encountered German positions that lacked anti-tank weapons adequate to stop British armour, that lacked artillery support to suppress British infantry, that lacked reserves to counterattack British penetrations. The rapid advance demonstrated that German defensive system had been reduced to thin crust that collapsed under sustained pressure rather than defense in depth that could absorb Allied attacks and could prevent breakthroughs. The American Second Corps operations in Central Sector demonstrated improving American tactical capabilities that German commanders had previously dismissed. American infantry attacked German positions with coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery that achieved objectives methodically, if not brilliantly. American forces that had been defeated at Kasserine Pass in February demonstrated in April that they had learned from earlier failures and had implemented improvements in tactics and coordination. The American success demonstrated that Allied forces were learning organizations that improved through experience, while German forces were degrading organizations that lacked resources to maintain capabilities. General Lieutenant Hans Kramer, commanding Africa Corps' remnants, transmitted assessment to von Arnim on April 25th that his forces were combat ineffective due to ammunition and fuel exhaustion, that defensive positions were being overrun systematically, that organized resistance could continue perhaps few more days before complete collapse. Kramer's message emphasized that soldiers were fighting courageously despite hopeless situation, but that courage could not compensate for material deficiencies that made effective defense impossible. The April 27th Allied capture of Jebel Bu Aoukaz, critical high ground dominating approaches to Tunis, represented operational defeat that made defending capital untenable. German forces attempted to hold the position through counterattacks, but lacked resources to prevent Allied forces from occupying terrain that controlled access to Tunis. The loss demonstrated that defensive perimeter had been compressed to point where strategic depth no longer existed, where losing single position created cascading collapse of entire defensive system. The psychological impact on German and Italian troops of recognizing that defense was hopeless manifested in declining morale and increasing surrender rates. Soldiers understood that they were being sacrificed in defense that served no military purpose, that supply shortages meant they could not fight effectively, that continuation would end only in death or capture. Some units maintained discipline and fought until positions were overrun. Other units surrendered when Allied forces approached, rather than resisting futilely. The variation in response reflected individual unit leadership and morale, but overall trend was toward recognition that resistance was pointless. The specific tactical situation in first days of Vulcan demonstrated how completely Allied material superiority determined outcomes regardless of German tactical skill. German defensive positions that should have required sustained attacks to capture fell within hours, as ammunition shortages prevented defensive fire from stopping Allied assaults. German counterattacks that might have restored positions could not be launched because fuel shortages immobilized armor and because artillery could not provide fire support. German attempts to establish new defensive lines failed because Allied air power attacked any concentration of forces, and because logistics collapse prevented supplies from reaching forward units. General Lieutenant Hans Kramer, commanding Africa Corps' remnants, transmitted assessment to von Arnim on April 25th that his forces were combat ineffective due to ammunition and fuel exhaustion, that defensive positions were being overrun systematically, that organized resistance could continue perhaps few more days before complete collapse. Kramer's message emphasized that soldiers were fighting courageously despite hopeless situation, but that courage could not compensate for material deficiencies that made effective defense impossible. The April 27th Allied capture of Jebel Bu Aoukaz, critical high ground dominating approaches to Tunis, represented operational defeat that made defending capital untenable. German forces attempted to hold the position through counterattacks, but lacked resources to prevent Allied forces from occupying terrain that controlled access to Tunis. The loss demonstrated that defensive perimeter had been compressed to a point where strategic depth no longer existed, where losing single position created cascading collapse of entire defensive system. Von Arnim's April 28th radio message to OKW, requesting authorization to evacuate forces while evacuation might still be possible, represented recognition that Tunisia was lost and that preserving forces required immediate withdrawal. Von Arnim's message emphasized that Allied superiority made continuing defense futile, that each additional day of fighting consumed irreplaceable troops without achieving anything, that evacuating even portion of forces would require immediate authorization and immediate execution before Allied capture of ports eliminated any possibility of escape. The rejection of von Arnim's evacuation request by OKW represented Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawals that would acknowledge defeat and would require explaining to German public why North African forces were being sacrificed. The response to von Arnim ordered that Tunisia be defended to last man, that forces fight in place rather than attempting withdrawal, that resistance continue regardless of supply situation or tactical circumstances. The order condemned Axis forces to annihilation that served no military purpose, but that preserved Hitler's narrative that German forces never voluntarily surrendered territory. The May 7th Allied capture of Tunis and Bizerte represented complete operational collapse and elimination of any remaining capacity for organized resistance. British forces entering Tunis encountered minimal opposition as German defensive positions had disintegrated. American forces capturing Bizerte similarly faced only scattered resistance from units that had exhausted ammunition and that lacked capability for coherent defense. The capture of both ports eliminated any possibility of evacuation and ensured that Axis forces remaining in Tunisia would be destroyed or captured. The May 7th to 13th final fighting in Cape Bon Peninsula demonstrated futility of continuing resistance after operational defeat was complete. German and Italian forces compressed into shrinking pocket lacked ammunition for sustained fighting, lacked fuel for movement, lacked food as supplies were exhausted. Units surrendered as their positions were overrun, or as they concluded that further resistance was pointless. Some units attempted to reach coast in hope of evacuation by sea or air, but found no vessels available and no means of escape. The May 12th surrender of von Arnim and Army Group Africa headquarters marked effective end of organized resistance, though scattered units continued fighting additional day. Von Arnim's surrender represented recognition that continuation was impossible and that preserving lives of remaining soldiers required accepting capitulation. The surrender transmitted shock through German command, where loss of entire army group represented disaster, comparable to Stalingrad. The May 13th final surrender of last Axis forces in Tunisia completed catastrophe that had consumed over 250,000 German and Italian troops killed or captured. The prisoner total exceeded Stalingrad losses and represented largest Axis defeat to that point in war. Equipment losses included hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, thousands of vehicles, substantial stores of weapons and ammunition. The material losses were severe, but the loss of trained soldiers, including veterans of Afrika Korps and elite formations transferred from Europe, was irreplaceable. Hitler's response to Tunisia defeat combined rage at commanders for surrendering with refusal to accept responsibility for decisions that had created disaster. The Führer raged that von Arnim should have fought longer despite lack of supplies and ammunition, that forces should have attempted breakout rather than surrendering. That capitulation represented moral failure rather than rational response to hopeless situation. The rage deflected from acknowledging that Hitler's orders to hold Tunisia, his refusal to authorize evacuation when that was still possible, his allocation of forces to theater where they would be trapped, had been decisions that doomed Axis forces. The strategic consequences of Tunisia loss extended beyond immediate military defeat to fundamental shift in Mediterranean theater dynamics. Allied forces demonstrated capability to conduct large-scale amphibious operations successfully, gained combat experience that would benefit subsequent operations in Sicily and Italy, secured North African coast for use as staging area for attacks against southern Europe. Axis forces lost presence in Africa that they would never regain, lost control of Mediterranean shipping that forced reliance on longer routes for supplies to Italy, lost strategic initiative in theater to allies who would dictate when and where subsequent operations would occur. The impact on Germany's Italian ally of Tunisia defeat was severe and contributed to Italy's eventual decision to change sides. Italian forces had suffered catastrophic casualties in Tunisia, with over 100,000 Italian troops captured. Italian military recognized that they were losing war and that continued alliance with Germany was leading to national disaster. Italian civilian leadership understood that Allied forces positioned in North Africa could invade Italy, and that defending Peninsula without German support was impossible. The erosion of Italian will to continue fighting accelerated through summer 1943 and culminated in September surrender. The operational lessons that should have been learned from Tunisia included recognition that holding positions that could not be supplied was guaranteed path to disaster, that tactical skill could not overcome overwhelming material disadvantages, that evacuating forces, while that remained possible, preserved military capability, while fighting to destruction accomplished nothing. The lessons were identified by professional military officers, but were not consistently applied because Hitler's command authority enabled him to repeat same errors in subsequent operations where forces were ordered to hold untenable positions until they were destroyed. The comparison between Tunisia and Stalingrad revealed pattern where Hitler insisted that encircled or isolated forces hold positions rather than withdrawing or breaking out, where promises of relief or resupply proved illusory, where entire armies were destroyed that might have been saved through timely decisions to evacuate. The pattern demonstrated that Tunisia was not isolated incident, but reflected systematic command dysfunction, where ideological considerations overrode military judgment, and where operational failures were blamed on subordinates rather than on flawed command decisions. The intelligence failures that contributed to Tunisia disaster included German command's systematic underestimation of Allied capabilities and overestimation of Axis ability to sustain operations with inadequate supplies. German assessments through early 1943 had suggested that Allies lacked combat experience to defeat German forces, that Allied coordination between American and British forces would be poor, that Allied material advantages could be neutralized through superior German tactics. The assessments proved wrong as Allied forces demonstrated improving capabilities and as material advantages proved decisive regardless of tactical competence. The logistics planning failures that doomed Tunisia defense included inadequate assessment of supply requirements, unrealistic assumptions about ability to maintain supply lines across Mediterranean, insufficient allocation of shipping and air transport to maintain forces committed to theater. The planning assumed that Axis forces in Tunisia could be sustained with deliveries that actual experience demonstrated were impossible to achieve given Allied interdiction capabilities. The gap between planning assumptions and operational reality meant that forces committed to Tunisia were being deployed to position where they could not be adequately supplied. The political considerations that overrode military logic in Tunisia decision-making included Hitler's conviction that holding North Africa was essential for maintaining Axis prestige, that abandoning Africa would encourage defection by Italy and other allies, that resistance regardless of cost demonstrated German determination. The political calculations ignored that losing 250,000 troops in doomed defense damaged German military capability more than evacuating forces would have damaged prestige, that Italy's loyalty was being undermined by catastrophic losses rather than being strengthened by continued resistance. The moment when German generals learned Tunisia was lost cannot be identified as single revelation because recognition came progressively through March to April 1943 as various indicators converged. Von Arnim's assumption of command in March came with understanding that supply situation made sustained defense problematic. The April intelligence about Allied offensive preparations demonstrated that attack would come soon with overwhelming force. The April 22nd beginning of Allied offensive and immediate operational collapse demonstrated that defense could not be sustained. The April 28th recognition that evacuation was necessary but would not be authorized demonstrated that forces would be sacrificed. The May 7th to 13th final collapse validated what professional military judgment had identified weeks earlier, that Tunisia was lost and that forces committed there would be destroyed. The final assessment was that German generals learned Tunisia was lost through progressive crisis from March through May 1943 that demonstrated Allied material superiority combined with Axis supply collapse made defeat inevitable, that holding North Africa was operationally impossible regardless of German tactical competence or determination, that evacuation was strategically necessary but politically unacceptable to Hitler. The learning came too late to prevent disaster because Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal condemned forces to destruction, because professional military advice about necessity of evacuation was rejected as defeatism, because operational realities were subordinated to political and ideological considerations that valued holding territory over preserving forces. The Tunisia defeat represented catastrophic loss of trained troops and equipment that Germany could not replace, demonstrated pattern of command dysfunction, where forces were committed to untenable positions and were destroyed when rational strategy would have preserved them, shifted Mediterranean strategic initiative to allies who would use North African bases to invade Sicily and Italy. The recognition that Tunisia was lost marked another step in trajectory from German offensive dominance to defensive crisis to inevitable defeat, as accumulation of disasters depleted German military capabilities faster than they could be regenerated.